Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Young Ho Cho. Have you ever perhaps just once found yourself thinking thoughts like these? Does God really exist? If God exists, why can't I feel that presence? If God is there, what is God's relationship to me? These questions aren't solely posed by religious individuals. They are questions all of us naturally encounter as we navigate life. When we stand before life's profound questions, questions about love, suffering, death, freedom, responsibility, we might perhaps instinctively find our thoughts turning toward the existence of God. The conversation I want to share with you today begins precisely with those questions. We will explore together the possibilities, how we might think about God, the different lenses through which we might view God, by examining 7 distinct perspectives. As we follow the insights of philosophers, the imagination of poets, and the deep reflections of theologians, you might discover a completely new sense or understanding of God. Alternatively, the questions you currently hold might simply deepen. However, either outcome is perfectly fine. What is truly important is not finding the definitive answer, but rather the attitude of carrying these questions within our hearts as we live. That itself is the point. So then, shall we take the first step together on this journey into the subject of God? When we think about God, the feelings and thoughts that arise truly vary from person to person. For some, God might be a familiar and comforting presence. For others, perhaps a vague and unfamiliar entity. And there will be those somewhere in the middle who feel, I'm just not sure. The topic we are discussing today, God, a story for the questioning mind, is precisely for individuals like these. It's a journey where we inquire together whether God truly exists. What kind of being God might be if God does exist, and what relationship that God has with us humans. Throughout this journey, there will be no attempt to impose faith on anyone. Instead, the intention is to open doors of thought, together with those who hold questions about God, those who are navigating the space between faith and reason. We will traverse philosophy, literature, and theology, presenting diverse perspectives on how humanity has perceived and understood God. Now, shall we begin with the first of these 7 perspectives for contemplating God? We often tend to approach God by trying to understand with our heads. Even when deciding whether God exists, we mostly attempt to approach it through reason and logic. However, this chapter aims to question that very method. Must God only be understood through thought? Could it be, perhaps, that God is a being who is felt? For instance, a philosopher like Descartes described God as the rational being, guiding the order of the universe, a being demonstrable through logic and deduction. Poets, however, perceive God in a completely different manner. Figures like Wordsworth and Blake felt God within nature. Through the wind, the trees, the sunlight, their emotions. Through these, they experienced that God was alive and present beside them. The theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher emphasized a romantic sensibility regarding God. According to him, God is not a being to be explained, but one to be experienced and felt. Another theologian, Rudolf Otto, used the term numinosum to describe the ineffable awe we feel when standing before the divine. And Martin Buber puts it this way: God is not an object of debate, but a subject of encounter. Meaning, God is not some it to be explained or proven, but a thou, experienced together within the context of relationship. The message this chapter seeks to convey is this: whether one believes in God or not, the very emotion, the experience felt when one thinks of God, that itself might indicate that we are already connected to some deeper dimension. Perhaps God is a being who draws nearer to us not primarily through thought, but rather through our senses and emotions, through encounter and experience. In this chapter, we will delve into somewhat more philosophical questions. We'll examine attempts to explain God logically and the inherent limitations of such endeavors. Early Christian figures like Basil the Great and Gregory Palamas, along with the Jewish philosopher Maimonides, commonly asserted, God cannot be fully explained by human language and reason. Therefore, they employed an approach known as apophatic theology, or the negative way. Instead of trying to define or circumscribe God directly, God is X. They approach God by stating what God is not, based on the premise, God is unlike anything we know. In essence, this means God is a being that we cannot definitively categorize or pin down. Of course, there are also prominent figures who attempted to explain God logically. Thomas Aquinas, drawing on concepts like the world's cause, modes of being, and purpose, presented his famous 5 ways to demonstrate God's existence. Yet even Aquinas ultimately confessed that the divine essence cannot be fully grasped by human reason. At this point, another intriguing figure emerges: the mystical thinker, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. He described God as a mysterious reality within deep darkness. He argued that encounter with God is not achieved through knowledge or logic, but is experienced in silence and awe. The message this chapter offers is clear. While attempts to understand God through reason are undoubtedly meaningful and important, we must simultaneously be able to acknowledge the limits of reason. Perhaps if we truly seek to understand God, what might be needed more than logic and explanation is an attitude of encountering silence and being, a certain humility. In this chapter, we aim to move closer to the center of our own lives. Is God merely a distant being, or can God be a presence directly connected to our lives? We will explore this particularly through the themes of love and morality. In Christianity, Jesus gave the commandment of love. Love God and love your neighbor. The essence of God, then, is love. However, this love is not merely an emotion. Crucially, love must lead to moral responsibility and practice. Judaism contains no fewer than 613 commandments, mitzvot. These encompass very specific and practical guidelines for action. The reformer John Calvin, on the other hand, while emphasizing human imperfection, believed that within God's grace, humans could live morally upright lives. And the philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that even if God did not exist, humans must live morally. Kant called the moral command the categorical imperative, emphasizing autonomy and responsibility, encapsulated in the idea, I do this because I and no one else ought to do it. Through this chapter, we will pose questions like these. For both believers and non-believers, what does it mean to live morally? And is the root of that morality love? Is it duty? Or perhaps both? In this chapter, we'll discuss the essence of God as conceived by philosophers. Across different eras and thinkers, the concept of God has been defined in remarkably diverse ways. Plato viewed God as the idea of the good. That is, God is the source of all value and truth, the being that provides the fundamental standard for the world. Aristotle, in contrast, understood God as the unmoved mover. He saw God as the cause of all existence, yet itself an unmoved, perfect being. Augustine described God as the one who created existence out of nothingness, creatio ex nihilo. He viewed God as the absolute creator of all things in the world. Anselm presented his famous ontological argument for God's existence. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, a necessary being that cannot not exist. His logic essentially states, if the most perfect being conceivable exists in thought, then that being must also exist in reality. This chapter showcases how philosophers attempted to define God rationally, yet simultaneously, even within their attempts, God is often depicted as a being transcending human reason. Ultimately, the very effort to understand God might be considered an act of humility, acknowledging the limits of human reason, and perhaps even a form of prayer directed towards God. This chapter contains truly beautiful content. If God cannot be explained solely through logic, how might God be depicted at the intersection where poetry and imagination meet literature and philosophy? Hegel viewed God as the absolute spirit, absoluter Geist. For him, God was a being revealing itself within history and human consciousness. It's the concept that God gradually emerges through time and human experience. Marx, conversely, saw religion as a product of humanity's alienated desires. That is, God is an illusion created by humans, merely a reflection of human society. Alongside these, there are perspectives like pantheism and panentheism. Here, God is not seen as a being outside the world, but as dwelling within the world, within time, within creation. Essentially, God is considered to exist as one with the world. In this chapter, we will pose questions like these. Is God a being that can simply be described with the statement God exists? Or is God perhaps an ever-unfolding story, a presence encountered within the poetry of life that we ourselves write as we live? This chapter addresses skepticism and existential angst concerning God. Here, some very candid and raw perspectives unfold. David Hume rigorously argued for skepticism about God. He asserted, "We can only trust what we experience. Since God cannot be experienced, belief is difficult." Blaise Pascal, conversely, presented Pascal's wager, suggesting it is pragmatically better to bet on God's existence than not. He presented a practical logic for faith. Since there's nothing to lose by believing, it's better to believe. Soren Kierkegaard, arguing God cannot be explained by reason, spoke of the leap of faith. He emphasized that believing in God is ultimately an act of decision. Even if one tries to prove God rationally, faith must culminate in a personal commitment. Jean-Paul Sartre, however, adopted a completely different stance, asserting that God does not exist. He declared that humans must take responsibility for themselves. Every choice we make is our own responsibility. In this, humans are utterly free and, simultaneously, utterly responsible. What becomes clear through this chapter is that belief and doubt about God ultimately lead back to questions about the self. We realize that asking about God's existence is, in the end, asking how I am going to live. We have now reached the final chapter. While we have discussed God in various ways so far, perhaps the most crucial question is precisely this one. What relationship does God have with my life? If God exists, does that God know me? Does God feel the suffering or joy that I experience? This chapter delves deeply into the relationship between God and humanity, addressing themes like the problem of evil, free will, and the personality of God. The existence of suffering in the world might seem to suggest God's absence. Yet, there are also people who find solace even amidst that suffering. The crucial point here is not merely the simple question of whether God exists or doesn't exist, but rather asking what kind of being God is and whether a personal relationship with me is possible. The possibility that God exists not just as an absolute being, but also as a presence that draws near to our lives. That is the core of this chapter. Well, everyone, as we conclude our journey along these 7 paths, how do you feel? We've explored diverse ways of thinking about God, through sense, philosophy, love, creation, poetry, doubt, and life itself. God is paradoxically an object that can be explained, and yet one that defies explanation. Perhaps God is not an answer, but rather a question that we must continually ask. If these discussions have prompted you to think a little more deeply about God, and if these questions have become an occasion for self-reflection, then I believe this time has been truly worthwhile. When the subject of God comes knocking on the door of your life again, I hope that the ideas we've shared today might serve as a small light in that moment. Thank you.